If you've ever found yourself thinking, they are so capable out in the world, but emotionally, it feels like I'm living with a teenager. You're not crazy. And if you're on the other side of that, if you've felt overwhelmed by your own emotions, if you easily shut down or get defensive, avoid, or feel ashamed of how you handle things, you're not crazy either. There's actually a reason for this, and it has a lot less to do with character and a lot more to do with development. In today's episode, I want to talk about how insecure attachment and addiction interrupt emotional development, how that shows up inside adult relationships, and what real catch-up growth actually looks like in recovery. Because what I see over and over again in my work with individuals and couples is not just addiction, it's developmental disruption. And if we don't understand that piece, whether we're the person with the addiction or the partner of the person with an addiction, or the CSAT working with the addict or the partner, we will mislabel what's happening. We might call it selfishness or immaturity. We call it another betrayal. And while those experiences are real and have a real impact, they're not the whole story. Let's start by simplifying something that often gets overcomplicated. When I say emotional development, I'm not talking about the ability to be calm all the time, or always being nice, or always having it all together. I'm talking about capacity or ability, competence. Emotional development is the ability to know what you're feeling beyond just fine or mad. I often start clients with what I call the Dr. Seuss emotions: sad, mad, bad, glad. We start to understand how those work in our body, how they feel, where they show up, what that's likely to look like when we're acting on them. And then we move to a layer deeper to be able to say, I feel overwhelmed, or I feel ashamed, or I feel hurt, or I feel anxious. It's the ability to stay with a feeling without immediately trying to escape it. We're developing the ability to regulate yourself instead of needing someone else to always do that for you. We work on developing the ability to take responsibility without collapsing into shame or defensiveness, and to develop the ability to repair when you've caused harm, and also to develop the ability to hold nuance, to understand that two things can be true at the same time, that you can love someone and also hurt them, that you can feel defensive and still choose to be responsible. That kind of emotional capacity doesn't just happen. It develops through experience, through practice, through repetition, and through safe enough relationships that allow us to practice. And this is not about being a good or bad person. This is about skills. Skills that often weren't developed. Because if the environment you grew up in didn't support those skills developing, your system adapted in other ways. When we bring insecure attachment into the picture, things start to make more sense. If you grew up in an environment where connection felt inconsistent or overwhelming or unsafe or unavailable, if emotions weren't welcomed or were not handled well, your nervous system learned that feeling emotions is not safe, that connection is not fully safe, and that you needed another way to regulate. For some people, that turns into overfunctioning. For others, it turns into shutting down. And for many, it turns into addiction. Because addiction is incredibly effective at regulation. Kind of. It changes how you feel quickly, reliably, and without needing another person. So instead of learning how to internally regulate emotions, the system learns, I don't even have to feel this. I can change it. And over time, development gets interrupted. Not because the person isn't capable at a fundamental level, but because the reps never happened. So let's talk about what actually gets interrupted, because this is where relationships start to feel confusing and painful. The first thing that gets interrupted is emotional regulation gets outsourced. Addiction becomes the primary regulator. If there's stress, I use. If I feel lonely, I use. If I'm bored, I use. If I feel shame, I definitely use. So the nervous system never fully learns, I can feel something uncomfortable and I can survive it and come out the other side. And if you don't build that capacity, everything starts to feel bigger than it actually is. Now, I do want to add some nuance to this because a lot of the clients I work with, this isn't just about things feeling bigger than they are. A lot of the environments they grew up in were big. They were overwhelming and unpredictable in a predictable kind of way. Too much for a developing child or adolescent nervous system to process. And when you're in that kind of environment, you don't get to choose development in a clean, linear way. You adapt. You figure out, what do I need to do to get through this? And often what that means is you push emotions down. You don't process them. You don't stay with them. You don't make sense of them because you can't. And over time, those emotions don't go away. They just go underground. And this is where addiction makes sense, because it becomes a way to survive what was already too much. So it's not just that everything feels bigger than it is now as an adult. For a lot of people, it started big. And without the support or the space to process it, the system never got the chance to learn, I can feel this and I'll be okay. Or I can feel this and I can go to somebody and they'll help me work through it. The second thing that gets interrupted is that distress tolerance stays low. When you haven't practiced staying with discomfort, discomfort feels overwhelming, sometimes even dangerous. So the primary response becomes get out of it. And that shows up as avoidance, isolation, defensiveness, shutting down, escaping, and lying. Not because the person is trying to be manipulative, but because their system is trying to regulate as fast as possible. The third developmental thing that gets interrupted is that empathy gets narrowed. I've worked with addicts who have worked with other therapists or gone to intensives, and sometimes they'll say to me, I hate that they're working so much on empathy. It drives me crazy that it's like, if I can just learn empathy, everything's going to be fine. And I understand why they say that. It's also one of the most painful parts for partners, because it can feel like, how can you not see what this has done to me? So what's important to understand is it's not that the person is incapable of empathy. It's that when someone is in survival mode, their lens narrows. They are focused on managing their own internal state. And in those moments, there's not enough room for someone else's experience. Sometimes with addicts, I will say, before you're going to be able to naturally or organically feel empathy for your partner, you're going to have to start to feel that for yourself, for what your life was like, for the impact of it, how you had to adapt, what didn't get developed, and not in a way that pushes them into being a victim, but in a way that leads them to have empathy for themselves, understanding of why they developed an addiction, and then being able to understand and have empathy for the impact on their partner. Sometimes I will say to clients, the impact you had is not evidence that you're a bad person. And when they start to be able to name their story, to feel the impact of their story, to be able to focus in on certain moments and memories and to talk about them and feel emotion when they're talking about them, and understand, sometimes they will text me or come in for a session and they'll say, I am in so much emotional pain. And I'll tell them, I'm sorry. That is really hard, because emotional pain is really painful. And of course, some of your emotional pain that you weren't even aware of ended up causing emotional pain for your partner. Just like your parents' emotional pain came onto you at a young age, that gets passed around. It gets passed to the partner. And the important thing is, we're not trying to shove the emotional pain back down. I will say to them, we need to trust that your nervous system is giving you these things because it believes that you can handle this in a way that leads to emotional healing. But before that, there just isn't much room for someone else's experience. The fourth thing that gets interrupted is accountability gets confused with annihilation. When someone offers feedback, it doesn't just land as information. Often it's landing with what the feedback felt like growing up. It lands as, I'm bad. I failed. I'm going to lose everything. And parents may have emotionally withdrawn at that point as punishment. And when shame floods the system like that, the response is almost automatic, meaning there's not really a thought process and a choice process involved. They deflect, minimize, get defensive, and collapse. And what comes out may be something like, I said, I'm sorry. What else do you want? Because the system is overwhelmed and it's not grounded in the reality of this moment. The fifth thing that gets interrupted is relationship skills don't develop on schedule. And I think this is where partners feel it the most. Skills like, yes, empathy, but also repair, consistency, transparency, emotional intimacy, and navigating conflict in ways that are responsible. These are developmental. And if development was interrupted, those skills are often underdeveloped or not developed. So the relationship starts to feel unequal. One person, often the partner, becomes the emotional adult, the one managing, monitoring, tracking, trying to hold things together. And the other is trying to catch up, or it's just going over their head. So let me speak directly to partners for a moment, because I'm not trying to minimize your experience. This is one of the reasons why I believe, as a CSAT and as a therapist, that it is healthy for CSATs to work with both addicts and partners, not in the same couple until way further down the road. But often when I'm sitting with a partner, it's helpful to have the addict framework and storyline in my head. Then I'm less likely to add my bias or my judgment to what the partner's trying to hold. I can understand addiction, not in a way that excuses it, but in a way where it helps the partner try to make sense of it so that they can move towards their own healing. And vice versa. When I'm sitting with an addict, it's helpful for me to have the partner narrative in my mind so I can accurately represent that partner voice when it's helpful in my individual work with the addict. I'm less likely to take the addict's side or to make bigger her emotional responses than they are. I can help put them in context, and I can help the addict start to understand what's happening for their partner. Back to speaking to partners for a moment. I understand you hold most of the emotional pain, and it can feel like you're married to a teenager. It can feel like you're asking for the most basic things: honesty, accountability, emotional presence, and you're getting resistance or pushback, defensiveness. When I'm working with partners, I will tell them asking for those things or offering what you've offered in the relationship in terms of what you bring to the relationship and the things that you've offered within that relationship. Often I will tell partners, those are healthy things. Those are healthy relationship things that you're doing, looking at yourself first, being able to accept feedback. And when we're not with somebody who has adequate emotional development, that's often turned against you. And that doesn't mean that when the relationship heals, you don't do those things. What it means is we're working towards both people being able to offer those things. That's a solid foundation that both people, in their unique ways, offer those things to the relationship. But when we're working on catching up, there's a really painful double bind for the partner because you need safety, truth, and steadiness in order to stay in the relationship. And early in recovery, your partner often does not have the capacity to consistently provide that. And that creates a lot of confusion, a lot of questioning, a lot of turning it on yourself and asking, am I too much? No, you're not. It's not your job to become a parent in your adult relationship. It is not mean or unreasonable to require honesty, repair, and accountability. It's not unreasonable to want an adult partner. And what you're feeling makes sense. I want to add something that I hear a lot from both partners and addicts. Often when their relationship first started, it felt different. Partners may say they were more open back then. They could talk about their childhood. They were emotionally available in a way that I don't even see them being able to be. Addicts may say something similar, but usually they're talking from the inside. They might say, I really believed this relationship was going to change me. I thought this was the thing that would finally fix it. And yeah, oftentimes during dating, there's slips, occasional relapse. But addicts often still hold on to this belief that the relationship will be the solution to their addiction. And I want to be clear about that confusion because I do think it matters. In early attachment, especially for someone with insecure attachment, the nervous system can experience connection as regulating. In fact, some of the attachment research and the neuroscience says for all human beings, one of the quickest ways to emotionally regulate is to co-regulate, meaning somebody you feel safe with, somebody that you trust, somebody who's close to you can show up and have compassion and empathy and sit with you while you're feeling those things. Their regulation brings you into regulation. So that's true. And that's how kids learn to regulate. If they have a parent who is emotionally regulated, that's often something parents are doing over and over and over again when the child is young. As they start to grow, the parent can still step in and co-regulate, and they can also help their child learn some ways to emotionally regulate on their own. Because as the kids get older and go to school, the parent's not always with them 24/7 anymore. So the child does have to learn how to do self-regulation when they're away from the parent. Co-regulation for the adult couple feels hopeful. It feels stabilizing. And it can even feel for the addict like this is different now. For the partner, it feels like, oh, I do still matter. I can show up and have an influence on them. So in that early stage of dating, there's often more openness. There's more access to emotion, more sharing about the past. Often in adult relationships early on, there's a lot of co-regulation happening because the relationship system is in a kind of connection-driven regulation. But what happens over time is that as the relationship becomes more real, more committed, more exposing, it also becomes more activating for the addict. Because now it's not just connection, it's vulnerability, it's accountability, and it's being known. And all of that can start to trigger the very attachment wounds that were there to begin with, that led to the addiction. What partners often experience as you changed, you shut down, or you shut me out, or you're not the same person I met, is often the shift from connection temporarily regulating the system to the relationship activating the deeper unresolved patterns. And without developed emotional capacity, the person goes back to what they know works. Isolation, avoidance, defensiveness, and often addiction. That early belief that this relationship will fix me isn't an attempt at manipulation. They believe it genuinely. They hope it's true. But it's hope without the skills or development to sustain it. And that's why, for partners, it can feel like such a profound betrayal. Because you didn't imagine what you experienced early on, but it wasn't built on capacity yet. It was built on temporary co-regulation. I also want to speak to the other side of this, to the addict. If you're listening and recognizing yourself in what I'm describing, this is not about you being broken. This is about development that got interrupted under circumstances that made it impossible to develop. You may be incredibly capable in many other areas of your life. You may be successful, smart, thoughtful, even deeply caring. But emotional capacity develops through practice. And if addiction has been doing the job of regulation, those reps didn't happen, especially in the relationships with the people we're closest to, like our partners. It's important to understand that recovery is not just about stopping a behavior. It's about building the capacity and the skills that addiction behavior replaced. I also want to zoom out for a minute and talk directly to those of you who are recognizing yourselves in this. Because emotional development that gets interrupted by addiction didn't start in adulthood. This is developmental, meaning it happens at different time periods of our development as a human being. And I want to walk through what it's supposed to look like. I have a lot of clients, or sometimes in the men's group that I facilitate, I'll say, this is what was supposed to happen. And they've said, I don't think I'll ever get tired of hearing what it should have looked like. And it's also so surprising to me that people can do that. So I want to walk through it in a really human way. Because as a parent myself, my kids are all in their 20s now. One is about to turn 30 next week. I've had a front row to what emotional development actually looks like over time. And this doesn't mean I'm a perfect parent. It doesn't mean you have to be a perfect parent. I tell my kids, I've said on this podcast, I'm really fortunate, and my kids and husband are really lucky that I became a therapist when I was 25 years old. I ever had kids. So I had the knowledge. I had to expand on that knowledge. And I was gaining experience working with clients. And it still didn't mean I'm a perfect parent. And again, the research does not say you have to be a perfect parent, not even close to being perfect. One of the things I will say that you learn really quickly as a parent is that kids lie. I think most experts in child development say this starts between 4 and 5 years old. When they're little, they're not very good at it. Often what they're telling you doesn't make sense. They can say, I didn't eat the cookie, and they've got chocolate chip still left on their face and crumbs on their lips. There's inconsistencies in what they're telling you versus what you can see as a parent. You can tell something's off. Sometimes it's really obvious what the truth is. And as a parent, if you take that personally, how can my child lie to me? You're going to miss what's actually happening. Because lying at that stage is developmental. It's a child trying to navigate, am I safe? Will I get in trouble? And how do I manage this situation? So instead of reacting with shame or punishment, the work is to stay curious as a parent, to ask questions, to gently move toward the truth. And when they finally tell you the truth, sometimes that's when you're tucking them into bed, your response matters so much. It's not what's wrong with you, or it's bad, the kids lie, or why would you lie to me? It's asking them about why they did that, letting them know, I understand why you did that. And it's actually easier for mom and dad if you tell us the truth, because we can't really help you if we don't know what's real. That's how development happens. Not perfectly, but through repetition, they start to learn I can tell the truth and still be okay. Now, if we fast forward into adolescence, teenagers lie too. Often it's a little more sophisticated. There's more at stake. Their identity, their independence, peer relationships, and autonomy are all at stake. Now, for me and my husband, at that time, we were watching Survivor, and I said to him, I think our parenting philosophy with our teenagers, which we had several at that time, is very similar to the Survivor motto. With teens, you have to outwit, you have to outlast, and you have to outplay. With young kids, you do have to outlast them. But with teens, you also have to outwit and outplay them. Because teens are going to test boundaries. They're going to experiment. They're going to try to manage their world in ways that don't always include you. That's part of them figuring out who they are separate from parents. The work isn't to control that completely. It's to stay in relationship while holding boundaries. To keep creating a space where truth is safer than hiding. And when I say you outlast them, sometimes for teens, outlasting them can take a year, maybe more. With my youngest, I think she, in some ways, is the most stubborn. She was born 5 weeks early. She had an infection. They thought she was going through drug withdrawal. She was not. And I've said to her, when you were born, you had to fight for life. We have pictures of her hooked up to all these different things in the NICU. They were putting IVs into her. Eventually, the only vein they could find was in the top of her head. So sad. So I will say, you were born needing to fight for life. And one of the best things you can learn in life is that you don't have to attend every fight you're invited to. Sometimes you can let one go by and you're going to be no worse for not stepping into it. High school was rough, especially between her and I. I had read things about how for daughters and sons, because mom is associated with them being a baby, a toddler, as they're growing up, they often push away from mom because they're stepping into older teen autonomy and preparing to eventually be young adult and have some experience with autonomy. And those years were long for me. It felt like I couldn't say anything without her rolling her eyes or acting like I had just said the worst thing in the world. Not so much with dad. She loved dad. She was close to dad. And I was really grateful. I said to him, I'm so glad as parents between the two of us, we are not competitive. You're not using it against me that she's moving closer to you and away from me. And I trust you. So I don't think her getting close to you is going to do any real harm because she's moving away from me. I think we're largely on the same page, even though how we do things is different. Her friend moved in with us their sophomore year, and I didn't have the same experience with her friend. Sometimes after my daughter would act like I just said the craziest thing or the most unreasonable thing, and she walked out of the room, her friend would look at me and just shrug her shoulders like, I don't know what that was. And I would just smile. Any positive interaction we could have, I was grateful for. The negative ones that came more often, I just had to get through them and not make anything worse. After daughter number 4 graduated from high school, she was standing in the kitchen. I was in the kitchen cooking. She was standing at the end of the bar, and her friend was at the other end of the bar. My daughter said, you know, Mom, I don't know why for so many years during high school, I felt like you were the cause of all of my problems. I said, yeah, I don't either. She said, because today you're largely the same way that you were then. But I don't think you're the cause of all my problems. In fact, I don't think you caused my problems at all. And I said, well, I'm glad to hear that. And her friend said, just for the record, Jackie, I never thought you were the cause of her problems. I said, thank you, Lillian. I appreciate that. So outlasting was rough. It was hard. It was not as long with my other 3 teenagers. With daughter number 4, it was just different. The work with teens is to keep creating a space where truth is safer than hiding, even if that truth comes when they're a young adult. Part of parenting at the adolescent stage is holding both boundaries and trust. Yes, sometimes you have to say no. And when you do, you need to explain your reasoning. You need to explain why you're saying no. And you also have to look for the times you can say yes, even when you're not sure it will work out. Because sometimes, as the parent, you're wrong, and it does work out. And sometimes it doesn't. It may have been a good idea, and they may have put a lot of effort into it. It doesn't matter so much if it works out or doesn't work out. Because either way, as the parent, you're communicating, I trust you enough to try. And I trust you enough to learn. And that starts to build some capacity in them, not control. What I have found is that even into young adulthood, testing boundaries or lying doesn't just disappear because they're now young adults. I've had times with my own adult kids. One of them, a couple of years ago, she was in her mid-20s, and she came over. It was Super Bowl Sunday. She had told us that she had plans, but then showed up for dinner and was eating with us, which was fine. We were finishing up dinner. We were still sitting at the table, and I said, I thought you had a Super Bowl party tonight. And she said, oh, I do. I'm thinking, okay, why did you just eat here? I said, most Super Bowl parties have food. And she's like, oh, yeah, we're not doing food. I'm thinking, that's weird. And I said, what time are you going? And she said, oh, we're starting at 8:30. And I said, well, the Super Bowl is usually over by 8:30. Why are you guys starting at 8:30? I was not sitting there thinking, oh, you're lying to me, because she's in her mid-20s. She lived on her own. She didn't live with us. So I wasn't even thinking that. But the story was not adding up. And I was just asking questions. And finally, Lillian, who was sitting at the table, said, okay, Jackie, okay, I can't take it anymore. She's lying to you. And I looked at my daughter and I said, why are you lying? And she said, okay, here's the truth. I just didn't want you to know. And she told me what the real story was. There wasn't a Super Bowl party with friends, by the way. But my response wasn't outrage. I said to her, why would I care what you're doing? I mean, I do care what you're doing, but she wasn't doing anything reckless or harmful. And I said, you're 25 years old. You get to make your own decisions. You can hang out with whoever you want. You can go on a date with anybody you want. You don't need to hide that from me. In that story, what I'm trying to model is at every stage of development, the goal is not control. It's helping your kids grow capacity. Capacity to tell the truth, capacity to tolerate the discomfort of being known, capacity to stay in relationship without hiding. And if somewhere along that timeline, truth didn't feel safe, or honesty led to shame, punishment, or disconnection, or emotions were too big to process, development adapts. And what develops instead is to hide, to manage your parents' perception, to not get caught, and to not feel what you feel. And that adaptation can carry all the way into adult relationships. So when you look at your own patterns, the lying, the isolation, the avoidance, the defensiveness, the addiction, this didn't come out of nowhere. This is a developmental pathway. And recovery isn't about shaming that. It's about going back and building the capacity that didn't get fully developed along the way. So what does that actually look like? Because I think this is where people get discouraged. Growth in recovery is not dramatic. It's repetitive. It's small. And it requires consistency, just as it would have when you were young. It starts with learning to name what you're feeling. It's learning to name what you're feeling. Not after things escalate, but before. I feel overwhelmed. I feel anxious. I feel ashamed. I feel stupid. I feel embarrassed. Now, that might sound simple, but for a lot of people, it's brand new. And it goes against what they learned growing up. So it looks like staying present with discomfort. Can you sit with a feeling for even 90 seconds? If not, let's start with 45. Can you sit with a feeling and discomfort for 45 seconds without fixing it, escaping it, or defending against it? That's where development happens. It also looks like being able to make genuine repairs. Not big speeches, not perfect words, not big promises, but small, consistent moments of, I see it, I own it, and I'm still here. It looks like consistency over intensity. Trust can't be rebuilt through intensity. It's rebuilt through predictability. Small moments of truth repeated over time. Sometimes we start with less risky small truths. Let me give you an example. I was with a client in a session. We were coming up to the end of the session. I think we might have been a few minutes over. And his phone rang and he said, oh, let me look at it. And it was his spouse. And he said, oh, it's my wife. Let me answer. So I sit there quietly, which I do if they have to take a phone call. And I couldn't hear what she was saying, but she said something and he said, yeah, I'm just pulling into the gas station. I've got to fill up the car and then I'm headed home. And then there was a little bit back and forth and he said, okay, see you in a bit, and hung up. And I looked at him and said, why did you lie? And he said, I didn't lie. I'm going to the gas station right after this and filling up and then I'm headed home. And I said, but that's not what you just said. You said, I'm just pulling into a gas station. And he said, yeah. I said, but that's not true. You're sitting in my office in a chair. And he said, well, does that matter? And I said, we can talk about this more next time because I know you have to go. But it does matter if we're working on telling the truth in small moments about small things. Then yes, it does matter. We talked about it later in the next session. We talked about it for a while because yes, that does matter. It also looks like learning relational adulthood, not making promises you can't keep or aren't capable yet of keeping. Setting boundaries for yourself that you can maintain. Respecting your partner's boundaries. Making requests. Identifying your wants and needs. Listening to understand, which means listening without immediately preparing a rebuttal or a response. And it means taking accountability without collapsing into shame. All of these are learned skills that didn't get developed in healthy ways while you were growing up. They aren't personality traits that you either have or don't have. It's one of the reasons why group work can be so powerful, because it becomes a kind of developmental gym. You practice showing up. You get feedback. You experience rupture. You also experience care. And you practice repair in real time. This is the shift that needs to happen in recovery. Recovery isn't just treating behavior. We're building capacity, and we're supporting development that didn't get the chance to fully form. Now, I want to end this episode by speaking to all sides of this. To partners, your pain makes sense. To addicts, your shame makes sense. But it can't be what drives your recovery. And to other clinicians who work with sex addiction and betrayal trauma, this is slow work, but it's also real work. Development can restart. It's not fast. It's not dramatic, but it is possible to catch up. And it looks like small, honest moments repeated enough times that they eventually become who you are. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.